Ben is one of my favorite scholars for a number of reasons that will not surprise you if you know me. Ben is someone who does not like conventional wisdom. I have never known Ben to come at an issue and say, well, this is what the conventional wisdom thinks and I should show respect for that. No! Ben is someone who likes to challenge conventional wisdom. Ben is someone who brings innovative, creative, and rigorous thought to conventional issues. Ben is also a realist, but he's a realist who thinks that people matter. He's a realist who believes that the system of international relations is governed by material factors, but material factors that do not determine outcomes, but that are very open to the decisions, good and bad, made by particular individuals in particular moments. And I think that's an important way to view the world. It happens to accord with the way I view the world, so I like it.
I think the two, that makes it right.
There you go, right? We don't need any more than that. And third of all, and I know this from students we have shared, I know this from former PhD students of mine who are now on the faculty at Dartmouth with Ben. Ben is a distinguished teacher. Ben, in fact, takes his teaching as seriously as he does his research. You'll see that in the way he presents his work today. And he's someone who I think, like all of us, believes that transforming the international system begins with transforming the ways we educate ourselves about the international system. And he's a model for me in someone who does distinguished research and also distinguished, detailed, day-to-day teaching, and a model that we should all take with us as we go forward. Ben is indeed a distinguished writer. He's written one of the best books on mass killing and genocide. Not something one usually talks about at cocktail parties. Final Solutions, Mass Killing and Genocide in the 20th Century, a book that makes the argument that ethnic hatred does not create mass killing, that long histories of groups fighting one another are not the sources of genocide, but that instead the decisions of particular individuals, particular political figures at particular moments are the reasons that genocides occur. And Ben offers a lot of very helpful solutions in this book for thinking about reacting and also anticipating genocidal behavior, not based upon suppositions of ethnic groups, but based upon understandings of politics in different societies. It's a book well worth reading. Many of you in my seminar next semester will read it. So if you want to get an early start, read it now. Ben also writes on a variety of issues related to humanitarian intervention, and I will just, from his long CV, I will recommend to you the most recent and one of his best pieces, I think, in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, the November-December issue of Foreign Affairs. I know you have it all on your nightstands. The True Costs of Humanitarian Intervention. And in this article, which I think was out of a paper I saw Ben present years ago.
In Wisconsin.
That's right, that's right. Ben makes the argument that, in fact, humanitarian interventions are often ineffective and counterproductive in the consequences of what they do, and that instead the United States would be far better off investing in alternative means of helping populations, especially through public health projects, rather than humanitarian intervention projects. I think it's an interesting argument and discussion to have about the various ways in which one can react to perceived and real problems overseas without necessarily relying upon the tool of military force that seems the one most able, but often least effective in the ways American society operates. So I hope that gives you a sense of the range of Ben's work. He is a professor at Dartmouth College, has a BA from Stanford University, a PhD from MIT. And the last thing I want to close with in presenting Ben to you is he's someone who also uses different methods. I know many of you are in a methods course now. This is, I think, the first work you've done, Ben, with survey data. And I'm excited to see how Ben brings his broad knowledge of international relations, historical analysis, and now methodological survey work together. Please join me in welcoming Ben.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was an altogether too kind introduction. It also, summarizing my work like that, reminds me of just how bleak all the topics I seem to pick to work on are. I don't know whether that was intentional or not, but when you hear it all in one swoop like that, it certainly sounds like I've done something is wrong attracting me to all of these topics, and I won't disappoint with that today, I'm afraid, either. When I talk about this latest project. This project is part of a larger series of projects that I've been conducting with two colleagues, Scott Sagan, who many of you will know from Stanford University, and Darryl Press, my colleague at Dartmouth. And this is a broader project to try to understand the sources of American public opinion towards nuclear weapons, which we think have not been adequately explored up until now. And there's a couple of contributions that this project hopes to make. First of all, it helps to try to assess the power of international norms in shaping outcomes in the international system and shaping people's attitudes. Are there norms? What kind of norms are they? And what are their effects? Second, it's part of the effort to contribute to solving what Thomas Schelling called the most astonishing event of the 20th century, which he said was an event that didn't happen, and that's the non-use of nuclear weapons since 1945. So part of this is to help us understand why could that have happened, or why did that not happen? And then finally, it's lastly a part of an effort to contribute to a sort of debate within international relations theory about the power of norms and institutions to shape state behavior. So a number of different debates that we're hoping to contribute to. And really we are trying to understand why is it that nuclear weapons have not been used since 1945? What norms, if any, are driving American public attitudes towards these topics or towards this issue? So here's the question. Is there an aversion to nuclear use, and if so, how strong is it? And there are really three main schools of thought on this question. And I'll say at the outset, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. In fact, you'll see we do find evidence for all of these, although some are stronger than others. But I think it's really not plausible to think that any one of these theories is sort of working all by itself. So let's talk about each of them briefly, and then I'll get into how we analyze them. The first school of thought on the aversions to nuclear use comes from a school of thought known as social constructivism, and is most closely associated with a scholar named Nina Tannenwald, although several other people have written on this, including T.V. Paul and others. And according to this argument, an ethical norm has arisen around the use of nuclear weapons. It may have emerged, according to some scholars, out of a norm against killing non-combatants sometime after the end of World War II. But now it has come to be separate from the question of killing non-combatants, and it's something that adheres to nuclear weapons themselves. Right? Nuclear weapons now, according to this argument, belong in a separate category. They are, in and of themselves, illegitimate weapons. They're weapons of mass destruction. They're not simply larger conventional weapons, and there's something immoral about them. In the most extreme form that I think Tannenwald adopts, we're talking here about a nuclear taboo. And in this view, nuclear weapons have become essentially unthinkable. In crises and conflicts, we don't weigh the costs and benefits of nuclear weapons and decide against them. We simply don't consider them. And we think about the use of nuclear weapons as being somehow uncivilized, disgusting in the way that other taboos you can think about are. They're really a separate category of weapons, and their use is in and of itself unethical. So that's the first school of thought. The second school of thought is one that sometimes gets called a rational functionalist school, and sometimes it's just called the tradition of non-use as opposed to a taboo of non-use. And again here, Scott Sagan, my co-author, is one of the first people to make this argument, but T.V. Paul also makes this argument in his latest book. And according to this view, there's no real ethical prohibition on the use of nuclear weapons. Rather, leaders refrain from using nuclear weapons and have done so in the past because they fear that if they do so, they'll set a dangerous precedent, and that precedent might outweigh any immediate military utility that nuclear weapons might provide in the present crisis. And there are two precedents that they worry that this could set. One, most importantly, they worry that using nuclear weapons could set a precedent that would allow others to use nuclear weapons against us or our allies in the future. So we'll let the genie out of the bottle, so to speak. And second, they worry that it will encourage others who don't have nuclear weapons at present to develop them, because they'll see that nuclear weapons are usable and valuable, and they will develop them, and that will constrain American influence in the future, will be deterred. So again, in this view, non-use of nuclear weapons is kind of a tacit agreement between the people who make the decisions, elites. It's a kind of equilibrium solution to a prisoner's dilemma game, to forego the immediate benefits of nuclear use in favor of the longer-term benefits of non-use. The last category is kind of a pseudo-theory, and I can't really point to anyone in particular who has advocated it, although a number of people have mentioned it in passing, including Steve Walt and John Mueller. And this one focuses on military utility. In this sort of most unqualified form of this argument, it says, actually, people think about nuclear weapons just like they think about conventional weapons, and the choice to use nuclear weapons or not to use them is much like the choice to use, say, air power to destroy a target versus land power, right? You weigh the costs and benefits of the various options and decide which one to use. And people will use nuclear weapons in this view when they have substantial benefits compared to conventional weapons, and when they don't, they'll prefer to use conventional weapons. But this school of thought also recognizes that nuclear weapons are not all powerful. They're blunt instruments. They have downsides as well as military advantages, and so unlike some people might think in the conventional wisdom, they don't always have strong advantages over conventional weapons. In fact, there aren't many missions for nuclear weapons in which they have clear advantages over conventional weapons. So nuclear weapons are good if you want to destroy large urban areas. They're good if you want to destroy highly hardened, high-value targets like deeply buried nuclear weapons, missile silos, or WMD facilities. And they're possibly useful, though there's more debate here, against targets like massed conventional forces on the battlefield. They may have significant advantages over conventional weapons there, although there's not as much agreement for that. And so from this perspective, the main explanation for non-use since 1945 is that the world hasn't presented policymakers with very many situations in which using nuclear weapons would have been very attractive. Those situations simply haven't come up very much. There hasn't been times when they thought nuclear weapons would buy us something substantially more than conventional weapons might do. We're getting a little music in the background here. That's okay, soundtrack's all right. Maybe later, we'll see how it goes. So again, as I said, I don't think any single explanation here is likely to be correct. Why do nukes require any advantages at all over conventional weapons, right? That has to be because one of the other two schools of thought is operating. And still, even if we accept that there's some kind of ethical norm or another kind of norm, a rational functionalist norm against nuclear weapons, we want to know how strong that norm is. What are the conditions under which, even if people are averse to using nuclear weapons, what are the conditions under which they would be willing to put aside those concerns and actually use these things? Let me show you just briefly why I think it's likely that all three of these things are operating by giving you some examples from arguments that policymakers made about the use of nuclear weapons in the 1991 Gulf War. And I'll just show you that arguments for each of the different schools of thought were made. So the first quote here comes from Buster Glosson, who, as many of you will know, was the chief planner of the U.S. air campaign during the Gulf War. And he says, he's asked about, did they think about nuclear weapons? This was in a Frontline documentary, which if you haven't seen is quite excellent. And Glosson says, I don't know what extreme steps I would have taken if I'd been ordered to use nuclear weapons, but it's absolutely so repulsive to me that it would change me as a person. Really sounds like the taboo, normative, ethical argument going on there. John Sununu also saying, we just don't do things like that. That's not something that a civilized nation would do, he's implying. The rational functionalist perspective also got some support. So here's Colin Powell saying we don't want to let that genie loose. And then Newt Gingrich saying it, I think, even more clearly. If the U.S. should establish a pattern out there that it's legitimate to use nuclear weapons, our children and our grandchildren are going to rue the day. We don't want to live in a world in which we'd sent the signal to every country on the planet to get nuclear weapons as fast as we can. Right? And then lastly, some evidence for the military utility theory. Here's that great quote from Cheney, which plays into the stereotype for Cheney. Of course not, but let's take a look just to be thorough and out of curiosity. Only Dick Cheney is curious about this subject, I guess. Colin Powell, too, more clearly saying, the results of our analysis, he was asked to analyze using nuclear weapons, unnerved me, but look, not because of the moral or ethical consequences. To do serious damage to one armored division dispersed in the desert would require a considerable number of small tactical nuclear weapons. And if I had any doubts before about the practicality of nukes on the field of battle, this report clinched them. So how do we test these different explanations and see how they operate in American public opinion? Well, previous research had primarily, as you could see, looked at elite statements about nuclear weapons. They'd gone back to crises in which nuclear weapons were considered, and they looked at what elites said about why they considered them and why they ultimately chose not to use them. And that's an obvious, reasonable way to approach this subject. But there are, and lots of good research was produced using that method, but there are 4 problems that stem from it. First, as the quotes I just showed you, I think, demonstrate, leaders say things that are consistent with all 3 explanations. And sometimes they say those things in consecutive sentences. So it's quite possible and reasonable to think that leaders believe in all of these reasons. Second, many of the statements that leaders make that have been quoted in situations like this were made in public. And so there's a possibility that the leader's sort of saying self-serving things to curry favor with the public. Third, of course, this method is limited to looking at existing historical cases where leaders really did consider using nuclear weapons. But as I said, one of the 3 theories that we're looking at suggests that the real historical cases that have occurred haven't presented very strong incentives to use nuclear weapons. So if we look at those, we won't know how leaders might have felt in a situation where nuclear weapons seem more attractive. And then finally, if we wanted to look across different cases and see why leaders favored nuclear weapons more in one case than another, we wouldn't know why that was, because across any 2 cases of considering nuclear weapons, more than one thing is different. Frequently, the president is different, the administration is different, history is changed, new weapons are available. And so if in one case we seem closer to using nuclear weapons than in another, it would be very hard for us to determine why that was. What was causing the change in attitudes towards the use of nuclear weapons? So how do we get around this problem? Well, that brings up the methodological innovation that Jeremy mentioned in his introduction, and that is to do survey experiments. Survey experiments solve many of these problems. What they do is allow us to carefully craft hypothetical scenarios in which nuclear weapons might be considered, some kind of military crisis situation, and then vary only one aspect of the scenario from story to story to story, and see what happens when people read those stories and we ask them about their willingness to use nuclear weapons, because we know if we see any differences in people's willingness to use weapons across various stories that differ by only one condition, we can say that that condition is what caused the changes in the attitudes of people who read the stories. Now, experiments have their limits too. The most important one used to be that we used to be able to only do these experiments on undergraduates. And there's no reason to believe that undergraduates are representative of the American public in general. But about 5 years ago, new technologies have come along that allow us to deliver representative, or surveys like this to representative samples of Americans over the internet. And so the results that I'm going to talk to you about today are drawn from a representative sample of all Americans age 18 and up, so American citizens. So that problem, which used to sort of plague survey research like this or experimental research like this, no longer applies. Second, and I think more importantly for this project, is the question of what if the elite, what if the norm applies only to elites, right? Those are the people who actually make the decisions, and here we're polling the public at large, not simply elites. And so, so that's a real limit of this. I'll say just 2 things about it. First of all, people who write on the nuclear taboo do think, or nuclear norms, do think that it ought to apply to the public, not just to elites. In fact, here's Nina Tannenwald saying that not only should we expect to see these kind of attitudes among the public, but public attitudes constrained leaders in the past. So I think it's fair to ask whether it applies to the public. Second, I can say within our sample, we tried to separate out people who looked more elite-y than people who looked more public-y. That means people who were higher income, higher education, paid more attention to the news, a number of other factors. And the only one that we found to be correlated with lower willingness to use nuclear weapons was education. So across all the other factors, we didn't find a kind of elite effect pushing towards less willingness to use nuclear weapons. So let me start to get into the description of what we did exactly. We actually ran 7 separate experiments with 18 different treatment groups, 150 subjects in each of these treatment groups. And we varied everything across these treatment groups from the number of enemy civilians that were killed, the number of US military fatalities suffered in the course of the operation, who used nuclear weapons first, and whether the United States had previously threatened to use nuclear weapons prior to the crisis. And of course, we varied whether the United States used or didn't use nuclear weapons across some of these stories too. The stories break down into 2 main types of stories. At the top, I'm talking about prospective stories. These are stories in which subjects read a news story that described a military crisis in which the United States was considering a military strike and had to choose between a nuclear strike and a conventional strike. But we hadn't made the decision yet. Then we're going to ask subjects about which of these options they would prefer. And then a second class of stories, which are calling retrospective stories, in which the subjects read about a nuclear or conventional strike that had already taken place, and were simply asked whether they approved or didn't approve of the strike. So we varied whether nuclear weapons or conventional weapons were used, but the strike had already taken place. Today I'm just going to focus on, I think, what are the 2 main and most simple experiments in the set of experiments that we did, where we vary the effectiveness of nuclear weapons and we vary whether nuclear weapons or conventional weapons were used. But I'm happy to talk about some of these other results in the Q&A if people are interested. Let me show you exactly how this is done. So this is the first of the prospective stories. And remember, I said here the United States is facing a military crisis. The crisis we chose was that the United States had discovered an al-Qaeda weapons lab in Syria that had been supplied with smuggled materials out of Russia. And the president has been told about this lab by the Joint Chiefs and has been briefed that there are 2 options for destroying the al-Qaeda weapons lab: a nuclear option and a conventional option. And in this story, the president is told that the probability of successfully destroying the target is equal for the 2 options, 90% chance, whether it's conventional or nuclear weapons. And everything else is equal about the story too. The same number of civilians will be killed, the same number of US military troops will be killed. That's 0 in both of these scenarios. So everything is equal. Right? So that's the first story. By the way, we chose Syria in the fall about a year ago, before the Arab Spring, partly because Americans didn't have strong attitudes about Syria per se. Then we just changed one thing. Right? So now notice that instead of being equally effective, now nuclear weapons are twice as effective at destroying the target than conventional weapons are, but everything else about the scenario is exactly the same. Right? And there's also a third story here, which I'm not going to show you, that falls in the middle, where nuclear weapons are 90% effective and conventional weapons are 70% effective. So you can see a sort of gradation of increasing effectiveness of nuclear weapons compared to conventional weapons, from being equal to being all the way up to twice as effective. So those are the prospective stories. In the retrospective stories, it's the same scenario. The United States had discovered an al-Qaeda weapons lab in Syria, and we bombed it. In this story, we'd use nuclear weapons to destroy the target. The target is destroyed. Civilians are killed. But the story emphasizes that nuclear weapons had been used. And in this story, everything is identical. Same number of civilians killed. Target still destroyed. But the United States had used conventional weapons. There's no mention of nuclear weapons. So again, you can see by changing just this one aspect of each story and then asking people a series of questions about their support or preference for nuclear or conventional weapons, we can begin to see what's driving American public opinion on these subjects. So, what did we find? This first slide just focuses on the first of the prospective treatment groups. This is, remember, the one in which nuclear weapons and conventional weapons are exactly equal. There's no difference between their effectiveness. And what you can see here is, looks like some support that there's a norm. When nuclear weapons and conventional weapons are equal, only about 20% of the American public prefers using nuclear weapons. When we asked those people why, they said they wanted to send a message to groups like al-Qaeda, not to try to build nuclear weapons. But 80% of the population said no. When there's no advantage to using conventional weapons, to using nuclear weapons, we will prefer using conventional weapons. But then when you look over here at figure 1b and we ask people, well, what if the president used nuclear weapons anyway? Would you approve of that, even if you would have preferred that he used conventional weapons? And there you can see it starts to look much less promising for the norm, right? Because about half of people said they'd be willing to approve of nuclear weapons in that situation anyway, again, even though they offered no advantage. And that was explicit in the story over conventional weapons. So people have a preference, but it doesn't look like it's a particularly strong preference. If the president thinks it was the right thing to do to use those, half the population is willing to go along with that. Let's look now at the retrospective story where the evidence, I think, for the norms-based argument begins to look even weaker. So remember, this is the story in which subjects read either in the dark gray line that the US had destroyed a target using nuclear weapons, or in the light gray line that we had used conventional weapons. And what you could see is that while it's true that a slightly lower number of people approved of the attack when we had used nuclear weapons, 68% to 73%, and slightly more people thought that the nuclear attack was unethical, or more thought that the conventional strike was ethical, just the two sides of the same coin, those differences are well within the margin of error of the poll. So there's no significant difference. In other words, when people read this retrospective story, all they knew is that we had launched the strike. They approved of it just as much when we had used nuclear weapons as when we had used conventional weapons. So why the difference here between what we're finding in these retrospective stories and the prospective stories? Well, remember, in the prospective stories, our subjects were told explicitly that nuclear weapons provided no advantage over conventional weapons. Here, subjects aren't told about any other option that existed or how effective it would have been. They just know, just as we would in the real world when a strike was launched, that the president chose that strike. And they make whatever assumptions they might make, as they would in the real world, about why we did that. But the point is here, when they weren't told that there was another option that was equally effective, that didn't use nuclear weapons, support was surprisingly high for using nuclear weapons. Almost 70% of the population willing to use nuclear weapons in this situation. This slide shows all three of the prospective stories together, and you can see here that's where that middle slide, this middle thing comes in. I told you there was a middle story. And what you could see, so again, the dark bars are the number of people who prefer nuclear weapons, and the light bars are the number of people who would approve of using nuclear weapons. So you already saw this slide here, these results. But these show what happens as nuclear weapons get progressively more effective compared to conventional weapons. And what you see is in that last set of bars over there, when nuclear weapons are twice as effective as conventional weapons, fully 77% of the population would approve of using them. So we have a good deal of support here, I think, for the military utility explanation, and some evidence of a norm, although I think it's a weak norm against using nuclear weapons. Again, I think this is some evidence here of a weakish norm, that when people know they're equal, they prefer conventional weapons. But now we want to ask why. Why do they prefer, why does even this minority of people not want to use nuclear weapons? And why do they prefer conventional weapons when everything is equal? It doesn't seem to be, as the taboo might suggest, that there's some kind of bright line taboo where, like, think about cannibalism, and you're trapped on a desert island. You don't eat a little bit of your friend as you get more and more hungry, right? You wait until it's absolutely necessary, and then you might break the taboo. That's not what we're seeing here, right? We're seeing kind of smooth increase. So at least on the face of it, it doesn't look like there's a taboo, but there could be a weaker kind of ethical norm, a more contingent ethical norm. So how can we find out the answers to this? Well, fortunately, in this kind of methodology, we can simply ask people. If you didn't approve of using nuclear weapons, why was that? So what this slide shows is for each of those three categories, the same ones that I showed you before, we asked people to tell us, if you didn't approve of using nuclear weapons, why was that? Notice here, the black bars are the people who did approve of using nuclear weapons. The other bars are all different reasons that people suggested for why they didn't approve of using nuclear weapons. So you can see the black bar is the biggest in many of these cases. But now we're interested in the people who didn't approve of using nukes. And we asked the public to pick from a list of several reasons, and we said, what was the single most important reason of these why you didn't prefer using nuclear weapons. And the choices included, number one, the fear that doing so would encourage other states or terrorist groups to use nuclear weapons against us or our allies in the future. That's the precedent explanation. That's represented here by that striped gray bar. And then a series of other options were given to them, including that nukes didn't provide enough military advantage over conventional weapons, that using nuclear weapons was immoral, that it was uncivilized, that it would damage our reputation with other countries, or that it killed too many Syrian civilians. And what you could see from this is that when people are asked to pick, the vast majority of people who don't want to use nuclear weapons say that they don't want to set a precedent, right? In fact, that bar is higher than all the other bars combined, except in this story here, where a lot of people say there was an insufficient military advantage to using nuclear weapons, because as you can see, there was no military advantage to using nuclear weapons. But in all the other stories, the thing that's driving public opinion is the fear of setting precedent. And it appears, therefore, that if there is a norm, or to the extent there's a norm against using nuclear weapons, it's the rational functionalist one, not the ethical social constructivist one. Let me describe two more results for you just to put this into context, and then I can wrap up. First, in an experiment like this, there's always some question about whether we were able to elicit the kind of reactions that people might have in the real world if they were to see a nuclear weapon used. And since they just read a kind of anodyne story here describing what actually occurred. And so we wanted to know, could we elicit the kinds of reactions that a taboo would elicit, a disgust reaction in a survey? And because that would help us know whether the fact that people didn't seem to have that reaction to nuclear weapons was an artifact of the survey, or whether that really reflected their attitudes. So what we did is asked people about a set of 3 different scenarios. We asked about our US nuclear weapons use story and the retrospective story, right, where they read that we had used nuclear weapons. We asked them to think about the US use of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And then we asked them to think about, what if you found out that your neighbor was eating dog meat? Right? It's a taboo thing in the United States. And we gave people a number of options to choose from here in terms of describing what their reaction would be, from unnecessary to unwise to disgusting. That's the key one for the taboo, to reasonable to immoral, and then maybe none of the above. And what you can see is that we were able to elicit a disgust reaction from a significant group of people, but it wasn't in either of the stories about nuclear weapons use, either in our hypothetical or in the actual use of nuclear weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was only in the dog meat story that we found a large number of people, 40%, saying that they found that scenario disgusting. And instead, the number one category for people in the nuclear weapons use stories, that their number one reaction was to find those things reasonable. So a majority in each of those situations found it reasonable. Second, you might be wondering at this point, why is it, if we see all these quotes from historical leaders talking about why they think using nuclear weapons would have been unethical, how can we reconcile that with these findings here from the study of public opinion? Well, one possibility is that people's perceptions of the morality of using nuclear weapons are not separate from their views of how effective those weapons might be. That the view that weapons are militarily advantageous and the view that they are ethical are not separate considerations. And we could check that again by looking at our 3 prospective stories where nuclear weapons became progressively more effective, and asking people across those different scenarios, how ethical do they think it would have been if the US chose to use nuclear weapons in those situations? And what you can see is, as nuclear weapons become more effective, people begin to think of them as being more and more ethical. It's more ethical to use them when they provide more military advantage. And so perhaps when people see a certain kind of ethical behavior as being dubious but unnecessary, then they'll say, I didn't do that when they write their memoirs because it was unethical. That was why I didn't choose that option. But when using weapons like that begins to seem necessary, they can repaint the same story to describe that choice as an ethical one. And people who've studied decisions that people make in war to do terrible things, I think will find that to be a familiar story, the ability of humans to redefine behavior that they thought outside of the war context was sort of categorically unethical as being ethical after all, when there seemed to be some kind of stark necessity for doing it. So where does this all leave us? There's lots of possible conclusions here, and we discuss more of them in the paper. I'll just mention two and then try to leave time for Q&A. First of all, I think the obvious thing to take from this is the recognition that the tradition of nuclear non-use is much more fragile than many people believe it is. More fragile than I thought it was, actually, going into this study. I thought we would see stronger norms than we did. And that if we find ourselves in situations where nuclear weapons provide some kind of military advantage in the future, public opinion, at least, is not likely to hold our leaders back from using them. Maybe we didn't encounter many of these kinds of scenarios during the Cold War where nuclear weapons provided really decisive advantages over conventional weapons, but I think it's plausible that in the post-Cold War world, we will see more of those scenarios, just like the ones that we presented to our subjects in this story, right? Some deeply buried, hardened, but very high value target. That's the kind of situation in which nuclear weapons are most attractive, and I think there's a good case to be made that we're likely to see more of those in the future than we did in the past. Second, if we want to preserve the tradition of non-use, which I think there are lots of good reasons to want to preserve, I could think of two things that we might want to do. First, we might want to consider accelerating work on conventional options that do some of the things that nuclear weapons now are only capable of doing. In other words, can we build conventional bunker-busting weapons so that we're less likely to find situations where only nuclear weapons can destroy a critical target? The better our options are on the conventional side, the results suggest here, the less likely we are to choose nuclear weapons. And then lastly, if we do see nuclear use in the future, we want to do everything possible to make sure that the side that used nuclear weapons is not seen to benefit strongly from the use of those weapons, because doing so would only encourage others to use nuclear weapons in the future, because again, they're not restrained by an ethical norm, right? When you see someone break a taboo, eat their dog, cannibalize someone, that doesn't make you want to do it too. But if there's no taboo, and if instead you think about these things in rationalist, functionalist terms, if you see someone gain a benefit from the use of these weapons, then you might begin to see benefits to using them or building them too. And so again, if we want to minimize those reactions, then we want to make sure that should anyone use those weapons in the future, they won't be seen to have benefited from it. So that's it.
I'm just going to play traffic cop. I saw Alan's hand first.
Can you put up the graph where a survey of like the 5 or 6 different reasons why they...
Yes. The one where you're shaking your head.
The one where I shaking my head violently. So look at the one on the left.
Yes, where they're equal.
And you have...
Which is left, Alan?
His left, right?
It's this one here.
Stage right. My left.
I don't know left from right. So
Oh, sorry.
Right
The
here.
one closest to Ben. First of all, Ben, thanks for coming. It's nice to see you. Ben and I were in grad school together a long time ago. Centuries ago. Anyway, so you have the set precedent column,
Yes.
which lines up with one theory, which is the rational functionalist. Then you have insufficient military advantage column, which lines up with one theory, which is the military utility. Then, for some strange reason, which you're going to explain to me, you have 3 columns,
Yes.
which you've divided into 3 columns, which line up with the third theory,
Yes.
which is the taboo. So why not be a little bit more conservative in your argument and put those last 3 columns on top of each other, and then lo and behold, they're just as tall as the insufficient military advantage one, and your argument is a lot weaker against the taboo.
So I think I said this, but we certainly say it in the paper. In fact, in every situation, the set precedent argument is larger than all of these added together, all 4 of them, actually. And that's statistically significant in this and that setting.
Those 3 are the same, then. More
Yep, you could.
Same thing.
You could say they're all the same thing. So partly we were trying to be as fair to the taboo as we could be. So we didn't want to pick just one. So, but what I'm saying to you, Alan, is even if we do exactly what you said, they're not taller. They are smaller. No, so they don't look as bad, but they are not taller than this. And don't forget, don't forget the black bar, right? So they're not even close to the size of these two, right?
My only point is, if you're really trying to make an argument against taboo, you should try and be as conservative as possible and not use any sort of methodological or presentational tricks
Yes.
or methods that might tend to downplay, right? You should do everything you can to make it as strong as possible. So you say you do that by having 3 different columns for it, but if you really want to do it, you got to put the columns on top of each other and say, here's all the support for
But
the
Alan,
taboo.
what about, just so I can understand where you're coming from, what about these two, though? There, it doesn't seem like it would make a difference,
Yeah,
right?
so then you can make an argument about how the advantage, military utility changes things.
We shouldn't get stuck on this, but let me just say, partly because when you take a poll, some people are not paying a ton of attention, and so a small number of people will just click on each option randomly. And essentially, for most of these categories, we can't rule out the possibility that nobody actually believed that, and that these bars are entirely due to the random number of people who you might expect would click on the category. So each one of them, the chances that anyone would have picked it is extremely low.
Yeah, but you have civilian fatalities is only 1%, so that's the maximum before by mistake, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Larry.
The scenario that you presented, at least in the class, is kind of what I'd call a limited tactical scenario.
Yeah.
With only in quotations 1,000 civilian casualties. It is very low on the spectrum of nuclear holocaust.
Yeah.
On one end versus not terribly different from a specific military strike or action on the other.
Yeah.
Did you test more extreme cases?
We did. So we had another scenario in which nuclear weapons killed 25,000 civilians, whereas conventional weapons only killed, I think, 500 civilians. In that case, people who preferred nuclear weapons dropped to about 35%. So only 35% preferred nuclear weapons when they killed that many more civilians than did conventional weapons. But still, a majority of the subjects approved of using nuclear weapons, even when they killed 25,000 compared to 500 deaths for conventional strike.
Prospective case as well?
In the prospective strike, well, remember, in a retrospective case, there's no way to do this. They just read about a strike that occurred, right? So you can't compare two things like that. You can't ask them if you had to choose. So in the retrospective, they just read about an attack that happened already. But remember, the key question for us is not, do people not like civilian casualties? The key question is, do they not like nuclear weapons? We didn't ask them a simultaneous question about, if conventional weapons killed 25,000 people, how much would you like them? That'd be the test we would, if you think there's some kind of conditional norm, right, where they don't like nuclear weapons when they kill huge numbers of people, but they do like conventional weapons more when they kill the same number of people, we'd have had to run that scenario. And we didn't run that because we weren't interested in a conditional norm or the norm about killing civilians per se.
So if I understand you, when there are more casualties, people get a little more squeamish, but they're still okay with it in general.
Pretty much, yeah.
This lady back there.
Did you find any correlation with controlling for age? So, like, for example, people who had lived through, ducking under their desks and sort of the idea of mushroom clouds and whatnot. My generation, the only thing we know about that sort of stuff is like what we've seen in movies and
Yeah.
what old people tell us.
You mean like Professor Inboden?
Did you find any difference in that? And then
No. The short answer is no. Older people, you can see here from this analysis, so this p-value here suggests that it's not statistically significant. It is negative, but it's a tiny coefficient, so there's no real effect to age. Republicans, on the other hand, like their nuclear weapons. College graduates didn't like them quite as much, but the other effects were not statistically significant in our model.
I forgot your name, I'm sorry. Jim, sorry. I wasn't saying Jim. I remember your kids' names, I forgot.
Do they have questions? I hope not.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought there was, don't giggle when I say treaty obligation. I thought there was in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, a treaty obligation by nuclear weapon states not to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. Does anyone recall?
That's correct.
Okay, so,
I just finished reading the book.
Oh, okay, so that's-
I'm pretty sure you're right.
thus the United States has a treaty obligation not to use
Yep.
nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear weapon state. I just wondered, that was one thing that, I wouldn't expect that to be a big, potential explanation, but I wondered if you thought about it.
Since there was a pause in this audience as people tried to remember whether that is or isn't part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, my guess is that the public has no knowledge of this at all and didn't take any additional treaty obligations into account. I don't believe we asked a question about treaty obligations. But in any case, even if they were aware of it, it's clear they were willing to override it, right? And I don't know how this scenario would have worked out, because in this scenario, Syria didn't have the nuclear weapons, Al-Qaeda did, although we did some scenarios where Al-Qaeda didn't have nuclear weapons, and people were still very willing to use nuclear weapons. But so I'm not sure whether some Washington lawyer could find a loophole and say, well, it's okay to use them against Al-Qaeda, we didn't use them against Syria. I just don't know how that would work.
Yes, sir, you've been waiting.
I may have read one involved in this, so maybe it's follow on. Did you find any information to say that non-nuclear countries see a political military advantage of having a weapon?
No, but we are very interested in trying to run similar studies in other countries. So I'd be interested to see what kind of results we got in, say, India. My guess is we'd find even greater willingness to use, less concern about the morality of these weapons among the public. I mean, I'm most interested in replicating this with some kind of sample of American elites, because I think that's the biggest weakness of the methodology right now.
All your questionnaires were U.S.
Yes, it just went to the U.S. public.
You didn't do anything around Japan or around.
No, but it is possible to do surveys like this in other countries, and so they're expensive, but it's possible that we could extend this research to other countries, and I'd be very curious to know.
It'd be great to do that, really, with Professor Buzz. So I think, like you, I share this concern about external validity. I'm not sure that the public is being particularly representative of elite attitudes, and Will and I are engaged in a project of trying to do some elite polling, not experimental work, but to the extent that it seems like that's an area where there's a lot of interest in the academic community, but it's very difficult to do
Yeah.
that. But I'd encourage you to move in that direction, because I don't know how much, for people who don't know very much about nuclear weapons in general, I worry about that. But I wasn't sure what the control condition was if you presented the treatment conditions, but I wasn't sure if there was a control in which there was no message. And so there are people maybe in this audience who do more experimental methods. My wife does that as a methodology.
Yeah.
She was on faculty with your brother when he was here.
Yes.
So in any case, I worry that the
Did they have a
methodologically
relationship
they're
or anything?
as same research method. But
Yep.
The other thing I'd ask you about is how manipulable are people's attitudes, because it didn't seem to be geared as much to elicit variation. You could think that the frame effects, depending on the degree of threat, might change dramatically people's willingness beyond the efficacy. So that might be one direction, or as one of the questions suggested, the degree of civilian casualties. It doesn't seem, and particularly as Alan suggested, fair to the taboo, because you could evoke the taboo in the whatever the message that you give to them, and that may elicit some memory. If you were to, because you have this Nagasaki example that people retrospectively may apply some, because it was seemingly effective in ending one of the worst wars we've ever faced, that they're able to, despite squeamishness, say it was okay. But if you were to imagine a similar type situation in which as many people were killed in something that wasn't for those same purposes, you may be able to evoke the taboo. And one other way you could evoke the taboo is through, depending on who the messenger that delivers it. So if Colin Powell says a statement versus somebody else who says a statement. So
I know that the cost may prohibit all these different variations, but I think that if people's attitudes are manipulable, there may be other ways to either evoke a taboo or to evoke, willingness to use the nukes in the same way that we've seen that's happened on torture over the last few years. But it's an elite-driven process in which the elites create a willingness in the public to accept something that was previously unacceptable.
So there were lots of questions in there. I don't think I'm going to remember all of them. No need for a control condition here. In fact, I'm not even sure how that would make sense. It wouldn't compare. We can't ask about people's generic. I mean, there is a question we ask people just in general. Do you think there are lots of situations or not lots of situations in which you would use nuclear weapons? But I don't know if we just said some. I mean, how could we ask a no prompt question about when you would use nuclear weapons? It's not.
I've done some experiments where you just don't give them that scenario, and you just give them a sort of
But
baseline.
then how could we ask them the comparable question about would they have used nuclear weapons in that scenario? Anyway, just so in case if you don't do experiments, some experimental designs need a control group, some don't need a control group. So at least as far as I know, this is one that doesn't require a control group. So I mean, you could think of any of the other scenarios as the control for whichever one you choose to compare it with. And then there was a long list of other possible scenarios that we might have run, and I'd be very interested in some of those as well. I do believe that that people's attitudes are manipulable, and that we have a lot of evidence about this in foreign policy, especially foreign policy public opinion, that the public's attitudes are capable of being manipulated by elites, especially elites that they trust. And so I wouldn't be at all surprised if we could give certain prompts from certain key elites that would reduce or increase the effect of nuclear weapons. What this study shows is that going into it, this is kind of where the public is. Now, an elite who wanted to increase or decrease it could probably play on that, and additional experiments could show us how much they could move the public off of this sort of baseline set of conditions. But as a first stab, I think what we're finding is not a lot of suggestion that there's a strong ethical prohibition here.
And I just wanted to ask you to sort of expand upon an argument you made that I think is very important in the paper. You just made it in passing here. Why do you believe that this research might inform us that the United States might be more willing to use nuclear weapons in the future? Why play out that scenario for us? Because if this is just public opinion and elites make these decisions anyway, why should we care?
Well, I mean, I think there is an argument, and it's an argument made by almost everyone who argues that there is a taboo or an ethical norm, that one of the ways that that norm operates is by public opinion constraining elites who might consider using those weapons, and that elites fear that the public is against the use of nuclear weapons sort of categorically. So if that's not the case, as it seems to be, that they're not categorically against, then even if this only applies to the public, I think the one message is we might be more likely to use nuclear weapons. Unless, of course, my paper never gets published and elites continue to believe that the public is against using nuclear weapons. We don't actually know whether that's true either. We need an elite survey to figure that out as well, whether elites think the public is for or against the use of nuclear weapons.
So you're not arguing that the public would push the use of these weapons?
Well,
the constraint would be removed.
Yeah,
those are two different
I don't think we have evidence here that the public would push the use of nuclear weapons, although one could infer, I think it would be a weak inference, but one could infer that, again, imagine a situation had cropped up in which the president decided not to use nuclear weapons, and then elites from the other side of that decision said, but there was a nuclear option, and that nuclear option would have been much more effective at destroying the target. Right. That's at least a plausible story about how the elite that chose to make greater sacrifices to avoid using nuclear weapons would be punished by the public.
And just as a historical point, of course, we've had that example.
Yes, and Truman said he thought he'd be impeached if he'd not used the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I don't know whether that's correct or probably not correct that he would have been impeached, but he might have paid a cost in terms of public opinion.
Yeah, my question's kind of a follow-up to Professor Suri's, which is, and I don't know that you can gauge this, but the sort of American appetite for conclusion now after being in wars for a decade and for 8 years, that the idea of nuclear weapons, the only time they have been used, they were the conclusive force to ending a war. Would that have any impact on why folks might be more accepting of nuclear weapons? This idea that if they are used, that's it, no more troops out, put weapons in, it's over. I think there's that sort of disconnect of these being the final ultimate option, not just an option.
So of course there's no way, unless I could go back in time and run the survey in 1998.
Or September 12th, 2001, I think would be interesting.
Yeah. So there's no way of knowing whether there's a sort of greater appetite now for decisive military engagements than there was in the past. Plausible, but no real way to test it, I don't think.
Okay, Professor Bussey touched on this a bit. Conventional warfare and nuclear weapons are inherently different in terms of casualties. So in some of in all of your examples that you showed us, you put that the casualties would be equal, which, in my opinion, and this is just from some outside reading, etc., one of the main reasons for the taboo argument is because of casualties. You disagree?
No, so some people say the taboo emerged out of a norm of non-combatant immunity. But the key is they're trying to make an argument that now something different has happened, that the revulsion against nuclear weapons is not simply because they might kill more people because then there's nothing new. Then that's the non-combatant norm that has existed for a much longer period of time. The key argument of the nuclear taboo is that there's something special about nuclear weapons as nuclear weapons. Even if, and you might think it's very unlikely that any two scenarios, the casualties would be the same with nuclear and conventional weapons, we tried hard in the stories to make that credible. We picked targets that were not in densely populated areas. We explained that many conventional weapons were required to be used to destroy the deeply buried target, whereas in the nuclear scenario it was 2 small tactical nuclear weapons. We still had a lot of civilian casualties. I think 1,000 is a lot in both of those scenarios. So we tried to make it as plausible as possible within the world in which we had to keep the level of casualties the same. Now I did say when we made the casualties not equal, I think unsurprisingly we drove down support for using nuclear weapons. But to me that shows that what people don't like is civilian casualties, not nuclear weapons per se. They don't think nuclear weapons are wrong. They think some of the things that nuclear weapons might do are wrong. And that's a very different argument than the taboo people are making. Right? Otherwise, why write a book about the nuclear taboo? Isn't it a book about the non-combatant killing taboo? Right?
Yes, sir.
There is a disconnect between public perception of the use of nuclear weapons, influenced by videos and film and so on, and the actual technical capabilities of those weapons. We're getting to the bunker buster point. You posit the notion that conventional weapons won't work, we have to use a nuke as a bunker buster. One of the problems we have in this country right now is that we don't have an effective bunker buster, nuclear or otherwise. The deep penetrator has not been adequately funded. The laws of physics intervene. The laws of physics are known to our enemies.
Yes.
And so when the mullahs burrow into the mountain outside of Qom, that's because it doesn't matter how many nukes of whatever size you drop on top of it, it's not going to destroy it. But there is a public perception that somehow, rather than putting in boots on the ground, or special forces in black helicopters, why don't we just drop a couple of nukes on it to solve the problem? Now that disconnect between public perception of the utility of nuclear weapons may influence your study. Now, have you been able to figure out a way of teasing out that kind of issue? In other words, people may prefer the use of nuclear weapons precisely because they don't understand how they work or where they won't work.
Well, in this case, I think we avoid that problem in a way. I mean, there's a problem about external validity, but we tell them exactly how much more effective they're going to be. So some segment of the public could reject that. They could disagree and say, I actually know a lot about nuclear weapons, and I don't think in this scenario that you described they'd be as much more effective than as the Joint Chiefs are telling the president that they are. I don't think there are very many people in the public who would have made that, who would have sort of argued against the scenario in that way. So here I think we have some evidence about if the public believed that nuclear weapons were as much more effective as we said they were, what would they choose to do?
That's a public relations issue.
We don't know what would be the, so I think some people disagree with you. I guess I would be one of those people to say that there aren't any situations in which nuclear weapons might have significant advantages over conventional weapons. I can think of situations, including the kind that I described here, where it's not the state of Iran burrowing into a mountain, but it's Al-Qaeda in a deeply buried facility, but not one built with the resources of a state, in which we could find that nuclear weapons would be more effective than conventional weapons. But if it's the case that the public overestimates how effective nuclear weapons are compared to conventional weapons, then if anything, these results would be stronger in the real world, right? Because people would, in almost every case, believe. And perhaps there's some evidence of that, because when we show them the retrospective story, right, even though everything was the same in that story as the story in which we used conventional weapons, they were much more approving of it there than in the story in which we told the public that the options were equal. And one interpretation of that is that they assumed, when they read the nuclear strike story, that the reason we chose it must have been because the nuclear weapon was much more effective at destroying the target, right? Because when we tell them that it's not more effective,
That's post facto.
yeah, that's right. So it's possible that that was what was going on in their mind, but we don't know from our survey for sure.
Okay, we have a few more questions. I want to make sure we get them in. So let's,
I'll answer more briefly.
Yes, I have a question about your samplism. You mentioned that the internet allowed this study.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that this was done over the internet.
Yes.
That is not necessarily representative of the American public as a whole. So how do you correct that?
So this is a survey firm called YouGov Polymetrics that does internet surveying. And essentially what they do is they ask a large number of people, I think it's 6 million people now are signed up with them. And then to generate a sample, they draw a representative sample from that 6 million. So that matches the demographic characteristics of the population at large. You might be still dubious that you could get a representative sample. The only thing I can say about that is this methodology has been repeatedly tested against random digit dial telephone calls, and the results are statistically indistinguishable. In fact, Polymetrics did better at predicting the results of the last presidential election than many telephone surveys have done. You probably also know, if you follow surveys at all, the rise of cell phones has made telephone surveys less accurate than they used to be. So lots of good reasons to expect this is very close to representative.
the other day, my 7-year-old, was answering a survey on the phone. So that's the problem with phone surveys.
I wouldn't want, if you were interested in a tiny part of the population like elderly, poor people, I don't think I would look at that corner of this sample and think you'd had a good representation of that group. But that's such a small percentage of the population at large that it doesn't affect the results overall.
Okay, a couple more quick ones. Yes, sir, you've been waiting. That was your question? Okay, you're next. Thank you.
Is there any way to test the context of the threat to the United States? For instance, you made several quotes from Powell and Glassenut about Desert Storm. Well, one of the reasons why I think that they sort of discounted nukes in that context was it wasn't seen, Iraq at that time wasn't seen to be a threat to us, other than the fact if he in fact got the nuke. But go back to the Cold War. Now the context there was our potential invader, Russia, the Soviet Union, had nukes.
Yes.
And they were threatening, or it was said they were threatening to use them against us. So therefore, I think the public then agreed to the large buildup in our nuclear force. So I sometimes wonder if the environment would impact the results of your study. In other words, if people saw dropping whether or not to use nukes conventions on a rock, or I'm sorry, on an Al-Qaeda nuke lab, okay, they may see that sort of sterile. But if all of a sudden now they were going to use them against us, would that change your study, do you think?
I expect it would. That one of the main reasons why nuclear weapons weren't seen as having as much utility as you might imagine during the Cold War is for exactly the reason that you suggested, that people feared that using them would result directly in use against us. And so those cases were largely ruled out, or certainly nukes looked a lot less attractive in those scenarios. So we didn't test a situation where the the enemy had the ability to retaliate, but I think there's every reason to think if that was made clear in the story, that people would be much less interested in using nuclear weapons in that situation. I mean, we could run it, but I'd be shocked if we didn't find a massive decrease.
So we are approaching the witching hour, but I see two last hands here, patient students, and I want to end with student questions, although I think it's always important to end with student questions. Usually the hardest ones. So we definitely want to end with the hardest questions. So two of you, please, go ahead.
I was wondering if ethics need to play a bigger role for decision makers because they have to take personal responsibility for the loss of lives. And if you might have considered that.
Well, of course, they also have to take personal responsibility for what might happen if they fail to destroy the target, right? And in this story, the failure to destroy the target is Al-Qaeda has a nuclear weapon. And you can presume what the results of that would be. So I'm not sure whether the ethics of it would lie, on the side of pushing them against the use of nuclear weapons, or that their feeling of responsibility would push them against using nuclear weapons. In fact, as Jeremy indicated, at least early in the Cold War with Truman, he felt that the use of nuclear weapons was possibly ethically dubious, but that nevertheless his responsibility was to use them. So I think we'd be just as likely to find that.
My question was, you talk about a situation where you think the use of nuclear weapons might be more palatable to the American people now, the idea of a hardened target or a hardened high-value target. And so when you were describing this scenario, I was thinking of the raid on Tora Bora in Afghanistan, where we have Osama bin Laden,
yes,
in a mountain, not necessarily a hardened target, but certainly a deeply buried target. And I don't recall at the time there being a discussion of the use of nuclear weapons to get him, but I was wondering, as someone who studied this issue more, if there had been anything, or what you thought about why we did or why we didn't use them and things like that.
I'm not aware that there was a discussion in the administration about using nuclear weapons in that scenario. My guess is that nobody thought that would be the best way to deal with the problem. I believe there was a poll, a poll of the American public that followed shortly after that. And I don't want to cite the wrong number. All I remember is a very high percentage of Americans agreed that if using nuclear weapons would have helped us get bin Laden in that situation, they would have supported it. I can't remember the exact numbers of that poll.
Go ahead, Jim.
Oh, I wanted to comment, there was an editorial from about that time, I think in the Wall Street Journal, you might go look for it.
Who cares?
Advocating, I remember it because it was a little forward-leaning.
Yes.
Suggesting, let's just use nukes. We need to clean up some caves.
Yep.
It would be interesting to look up. So please, I want to thank all of you for being part of what I think was a very fruitful and rigorous discussion. I want to thank the Strauss Center staff that put this event together. They're all seated up here. We couldn't have this event without them, so please let's thank the Strauss Center staff. And of course, I want to thank Ben for really giving us a phenomenal.
Thank you.